In the past 7 months, the U.S. Federal Communications Commission has been auctioning 24 and 28 gigahertz spectrum for mobile radio use, tripling the spectrum available to mobile phones. The more recent 24 gigahertz auction concluded May 28, 2019, having sold about $2 billion of spectrum. There were 38 qualified bidders, including AT&T, U.S. Cellular, Dish, Verizon, and T-Mobile, and their bids averaged less than a penny per megahertz per person in the regions covered. This is about 1/100th what low-band spectrum was sold for on a per megahertz basis. Much of the reason for this lower value is that this spectrum is about 10 to 40 times higher in frequency than the usual spectrum, as we see and hear. Mobile phones today operate in the 0.6 to 3 gigahertz range, but now, thanks to 5G, millimeter wave frequencies are added to the repertoire up above 24 gigahertz. Here you see the 7 blocks of spectrum, each with 100 megahertz of bandwidth. The FCC auctioned off this spectrum in 416 partial economic areas throughout the whole of the U.S. We see and hear the 91 rounds of the auction with regions highlighted when bid upon, raising their value as shown by the color keyed to the value per megahertz per population covered. A low tone signifies many bids, and the pitch increases as the number of bids petered out. The auction grew as the ascending clock auction proceeded until there were no new bids. Then, individual blocks were auctioned by an assignment phase in which bidders offered closed envelope bids with a second price rule, resulting in the final gross total of slightly more than $2 billion, as shown here, about 1.8% higher. We note the interesting 4-to-1 difference in the value of the 2 low blocks compared to the 5 upper blocks of spectrum, and we show the water vapor band used by many weather satellites that has been in the news recently. The winnings of the top 4 bidders are mapped here. AT&T bid nearly $1 billion, followed by T-Mobile, U.S. Cellular, and Starry Spectrum. Windstream was next, followed by Verizon and Dish. Sprint made no bids in these auctions. The map shows the winnings of these bidders, but also highlights in red all regions they bid on, even those they did not win. We see all 29 winning bidders, their gross aggregate bid amounts, as well as associated price per megahertz per population covered. Among the 2,904 licenses won, it is not surprising that New York was the most expensive, at a bit over $42 million. That's 5 orders of magnitude more than the $240 spent on Valentine, Nebraska, and the $300 on Salmon, Idaho. The second most expensive item was Los Angeles, that sold for $32.4 million, and then Chicago, Baltimore, and San Francisco. The average price was nearly $700,000, but half went for less than $35,000. The highest rate in terms of price per megahertz pop was, interestingly, in Van Horn, Texas, at $0.13 per megahertz pop. The overall price per megahertz pop was about $0.0093 per megahertz pop, less than a penny, and more than half were less than $0.0014 per megahertz pop. We can compare these numbers with previous auctions dating back to 1994 and see the trend of lower prices per megahertz pop as the frequency increases. This is particularly valid for these nationwide auctions, but we've also added November's 28 gigahertz auction highlighted here. That auction, number 101, offered two 425 megahertz wide blocks of spectrum in the 28 gigahertz band, but in less than half the counties of the U.S. The total of the bids for these 28 gigahertz licenses was less than $703 million, but keep in mind that this only covered about 24% of the U.S. population and less than half the counties. In the 28 gigahertz auction, the average rate was $0.011 per megahertz pop, with half going for less than or equal to $0.0014 per megahertz pop. The aggregate average was $237,000, but half the licenses sold for no more than $8,900. The winnings of the top bidders in each of the two blocks sold are shown in these two maps, with the counties color-coded by the winning bidders. The 33 winners among the 40 qualified bidders was topped by Verizon, then U.S. Cellular, and then T-Mobile. Next were Windstream Services, as well as Dish in 7th place, with winnings listed here. The FCC plans more auctions, including the 37, 39, and 47 gigahertz auctions set to begin this December 2019. The radio spectrum is abuzz with activity, opportunities, and threats. For more detailed information, please refer to the full report available here.